think today, like Tony mentioned, we're talking about messaging. So Messenger, Facebook Messenger, messaging apps, iMessage. So this is the first time I've sort of talked about this at a conference because I think it's really important. I think there's been a lot of buzz about this area. I think some of the press is potentially overambitious about the potential. So my goal here is to really provide like a more holistic overview of what I think the opportunity is. Again, this is just my opinion. I don't have all the insights necessarily, but because I think a lot of folks are very bullish on this, and I think we want to, from a business perspective, really sort of analyze this opportunity thoughtfully. So again, just to make sure we're on the same page, so we're going to talk about sort of from the business perspective, like what is this opportunity? What are we looking at in terms of corollaries in other markets to size this opportunity? What are some of the risks? So this is again from the business perspective. In terms of making content for the platform, we don't have time unfortunately to cover that, so I'm sure there are more experts on the design side. So quickly about myself, so working on my own for almost 5 years in the business side of the gaming space, mostly on mobile. I've actually worked with two of the larger messaging apps that are not non-Facebook. So I have definitely worked in this area and seen kind of the rise and changes in this space. So to set the stage, like this is kind of slide sums up like why I wanted to have this discussion, because I think there's a lot of like articles about like HTML5 and Facebook Messenger and how it's going to be the next. This is written by my buddy Albert at Big Viking Games, and he's a great guy. He has a really smart team working on some really interesting stuff, but $100 billion game platform is pretty ambitious sort of messaging in terms of what the opportunity is. So that's basically saying this is bigger than anything so far: Facebook Canvas, Google, iTunes, etc. So obviously he has different goals in terms of the press side, but this is kind of wanting to sort of wed this in some real analysis. So in terms of like the Western market, if we think of messaging, just to set the stage, we basically have sort of three main groups. So we have native messaging apps. There's a lot. You have Hangouts, Skype, Tango, WhatsApp, Kik, Viber, Discord, Telegram, Snapchat, and a ton of others, right? So these are, range from like 100 million to 900 million monthly active users. So it sort of varies widely. iMessage is around like 600 million monthly active users based on the latest information I've heard. And then obviously Facebook Messenger, which is the largest at 1.2 billion monthly active users. So these are kind of, when I think of messaging in the West, these are kind of the main sort of opportunities. So if we think about like gaming and new platforms, especially over the last decade, we have kind of a lot of examples of these kind of emerging platforms that became massive. So we have obviously Facebook Canvas with social games, created companies with huge enterprise value, and it happened very quickly. Steam, in terms of disrupting sort of the PC download space, obviously very impactful. And then obviously the emergence, 8 or 9 years ago of the mobile smartphone stores. So obviously iTunes and Google Play. So we've seen this happen not that long ago in terms of these disruptive platforms that created a huge market opportunity. And so I think the thesis is that is messaging like one of these, or it could be even bigger. So there's a lot of companies like betting on the potential of these new platforms, right? So you have Big Viking Games, who talked about at the beginning, who wrote the article. They raised over $20 million just to focus on HTML5 with a focus on Facebook Messenger. Gamey, Blackstorm, these folks have been working on HTML5 stuff for a while, so they have expertise, and now they're sort of doubling down, if you will, by raising a ton of capital. Game Insight is a very successful social mobile game company. They're investing a lot of resources towards this space. You have Zynga, who's got a pretty large team who's working on Messenger games, HTML5 games. And then companies like King was a launch partner of Instant Games in terms of the first releases on the platform. So all these folks are sort of betting on this platform at different levels, from their entire company to like significant resources that could be put towards things that might have more immediate revenue generation. Because as we see, like we've proven looking at those other platforms I talked about, that first mover advantage is critical, right? Especially coming from the business perspective. On the mobile side, early first movers had pretty successful exits. NG Mocha, which was tried to do like the first free-to-play mobile games on the App Store that was acquired by DNA. Taculus was really early on mobile too. It became part of Disney. Caban started on the social game side and then sort of burned their boats and moved to mobile, and obviously recently had an exit as well. So, and then if we look on the social game side, Facebook Canvas games, we have kind of the big three. Zynga obviously became a public company. Playfish was acquired by EA, and Playdom by Disney. These were guys that basically were early to the platform and then raised a ton of money to execute on it as quickly as possible and grow their businesses. Some of these things didn't work out very well, but in terms of looking at it from the business perspective and enterprise value, like first mover advantage is obviously a key thing. So in terms of like a lot of the discussion around messaging is looking to Asia. So a lot of the work I do as well as all around Asia and working with Western companies in this area. So the sort of dialogue is always like, well, we look to Asia in terms of what's happened there to validate kind of this thesis of messaging in the West as we have these large platforms. So just quickly want to go through that in terms of talking about what's happening there. So I'll focus basically on two of the larger platforms, KakaoTalk, which is basically huge in a South Korean market, and WeChat, which is obviously has very high penetration in China. So in terms of platforms, these things are have incredible penetration and usage in the market. So this is just some data, looking at KakaoTalk. You can kind of see it, but basically, 85% of all smartphone users are using KakaoTalk messaging app. And the last time I was there, like literally everyone uses it, like your grandma, everyone. So it's one thing to have like percentage of people using it. It's one thing to have a percentage of people using it so many times a day, where it's basically part of your communication and everything you do on your smartphone. So that's sort of the starting point in Asia. You have these messaging apps that essentially is the hub. We'll talk about a little bit later. And then next is basically we're talking about game distribution. So again, the thesis is like, we have the platform, we put games on it, right? And that is a revenue stream. From developers, it's a distribution channel. So if we're looking at these platforms, they've been doing game distribution for a long time. So Kakao was almost 5 years ago, they started distributing games through their game center. Basically, you go into the app, there's a game section, you can discover different content. You then click on it, it takes you to the App Store, you download the native app to your device. And then in terms of the messaging layer, you obviously can post and share in the messaging feed. So that creates like incredible distribution and virality. And then WeChat obviously launched this as well, roughly around like 2014. So again, we're doing the game distribution in Asia, and it works really well. So if you look at, I just looked last night, just on iOS and China, that 50% of the top grossing iOS games are connected to Tencent WeChat platform. If you look at Kakao, I just picked a random game, but this is a game called Cookie Run. Basically an endless runner with some more complex kind of RPG mechanics, because it's like in the Asian market where games tend to be more complex. Reached up to like 3 million daily active users, doing up $1 million a day in revenue from in-app purchase. Again, for an endless runner game. So without, and obviously, again, we talk about first mover advantage. This was one of the earliest games to the platform. And so if you look at these platforms, the most successful content in terms of commercially is always the first content. I could show many more examples of games that have done hundreds of millions in lifetime revenue and created like public companies in these markets just based on like 1 or 2 titles because they were super early to these platforms. So again, we talk about first mover advantage. It's obviously pretty important before these platforms get crowded. And then last, we talk about like HTML5. So in terms of HTML5, so in terms of game distribution on messaging today in Asia, like most of it's been focused on native apps. You are shifted from the messaging app to the App Store. You download the app, at least on the iOS side, and Google Play in most Asian markets. And then if you look at HTML5, folks have been experimenting with this for a while. So even back in 2014, as an example of just a game, I'm sure there's been more stuff earlier. You have HTML5 games basically running in the browser within the messaging app. And this is, as basically the technology has advanced and the devices have become more powerful, then you can do more. So you have games doing massive revenues, like running within the mobile browser, within these messaging apps. For example, like on WeChat. So basically, you're able to leverage the virality. There's like much less friction in terms of downloading an actual app. It's kind of like the holy grail of distribution on messaging. So the early indicators are quite positive from the Western side if you look at Facebook, Messenger, and other messaging platforms. So this is just some data that was shared by Facebook. If you kind of do some math, you get basically like hundreds of thousands of daily sessions per game. So first mover games, first 50 games, seeing like pretty high volume. I just did some like super rough estimates, basically saying like if people play an average of 8 to 12 sessions, you're looking at like 1 to 2 million daily active users. So obviously it's early. It's only available in certain limited countries. So this is quite positive. You have some of the early games. So this is a game from Spiel Games on Facebook Messenger, basically scaling to like almost 500,000 daily active users within the first 3 weeks. So this is great. This is great. Things are scaling. That's good. This is some data from Game Analytics they shared in another presentation. Green is basically like Messenger game retention. Blue is like native app, like a good native app's retention rate. So you can see that, like, in terms of retention, performance tends to be slightly better, which is what obviously one would hope with a social platform. So basically, we talked about we have the distribution. We've seen early indication of like, things being successful. We have these giant platforms. Does that mean that we're all going to be, raking in the dough right away from the start? So this is where I get into sort of more things I think concern me about the sort of total potential. And so I think about these platforms as being like incremental platform or transformational. So incremental is like, okay, I can put my content on here and make 10 to 20% more revenue for my business. Transformational is creating 100 million, $800 billion companies doing some massive revenue just based on this platform. Again, thinking back to like Facebook Canvas and early mobile companies. So some of the stuff that I've seen that concerns me, so native messaging app distribution has really been unable to scale in the Western market. So I've worked with these companies. You have Tango Messenger. They raised over $300 million in capital. They had a pretty decent focus on games. They do the same model where you download the game from the messaging app, et cetera, for distribution. If you look at the games they've launched over time, like things kind of like 2014 was like, okay, let's do this in terms of game distribution. 2015 is like, okay, we're still doing this. 2016, things slow down, and you'll notice there's no 2017 because they haven't released any new games. It's basically, it's done. It didn't work. If you look at another messaging app, Viber, which is bigger in emerging markets, definitely has sort of global presence in all countries. They were doing games distribution from the messaging app, just like we talked about. If you go to the app now, there's not even games section in the app anymore. It's gone. They shifted their focus to other areas for revenue because basically they couldn't make this business model work. We talk about this engagement hub. I think we have tons of users in these apps, but is it truly like a hub for day-to-day uses, et cetera? So if you look at WeChat, you can do a million different things within the app, right? This is something people are using constantly on a day-to-day basis. This is just some examples of stuff you can do. It's very diverse. And if you look at like basically the usage, it's incredibly high. So sure, everyone's using it on a daily basis, but they're also using it. It's 30% of the time they spend on their device is in this one app. So that means it's basically a hub, and we don't necessarily have that yet, in my opinion, with something like Facebook Messenger, right? Everyone's using it, use a little for a few minutes, to chat with people, but that's really it. And obviously they're adding more features around this, but it's still pretty early. Fragmentation to me is a huge issue as well in the West. So we talked about there's a ton of apps, right? We have WhatsApp, Kick, Facebook Messenger, Tango, blah, blah, etc. Those are for sort of like, I don't know, let's call them personal communication. We have specific use like gaming for Discord. And then we have some sort of work, you know, Slack or Skype, LinkedIn. And then you look at WeChat, like people, you know, I work with a ton of companies in China, like they use this for everything, for work, for personal. Like I don't email people in China, I just message them on WeChat. So, you know, again, we have this fragmentation in the West. We don't have like a single app that like everyone's using, even in like, just say US. So that minimizes the potential of having this sort of, I think, platform that has massive scaling potential for game distribution, if everyone's not on the same one. And then again, we have geographic fragmentation in the Western market. You can kind of see, like, you know, Facebook does control. These are sort of the most popular messaging apps on the Android side. Obviously, Facebook has WhatsApp and Facebook Messenger, so which is great. They have like pretty strong strength in all of these markets, or high strength. So that's great, but again, it doesn't illustrate like what's the, you know, what percentage of the market do they have, things like this. So there is a lot of fragmentation. Native user behavior. So again, you know, the reality is most users, you know, gamers and just mobile app smartphone users are used to using apps, right? So there's, from our side, we'd love to use mobile web for distribution. But you can see here that basically, you know, the amount of time spent in apps on smartphones just continues to increase. And mobile web really hasn't. So in terms of user behavior, they're used to going to Google, Apple Store. That's potentially going to be hard to shift to maybe doing HTML5 or other sort of distribution strategies. iMessage. So iMessage, great opportunity. The reality is it'll never be accessible to over half the market, right? It's going to be iOS only. So if you're building content for it, you know, obviously it's not like you're creating something from scratch potentially, but you know, what is it? Over 60% of the revenue on the gaming side on mobile is all on Android globally. So that's sort of off the table if you're focusing on that platform. To me, that makes that iMessage like incremental in terms of a platform for distribution. The other thing that worries me a little bit about is Facebook and experiments. So in 2011, if folks remember, we actually tried to do HTML5 games with Facebook. It was pretty much, I won't say a complete failure, but a fairly significant failure that, Mark Zuckerberg admitted, and they shifted to focus on native app development. But we had people built these games. At the time, the technology was obviously much more immature. The device performance was pretty poor. But they tried to build, HTML5 and Facebook credits for monetization. Didn't work. Next, they released kind of this mobile game publishing effort for native apps. They had like 10 games. Everyone was really excited about it, and then, you search on the web. There's not even like they deleted the whole thing from the site. It basically disappeared like kind of after the first round of testing. And then now we had Game Room, which is obviously a client on desktop. There was a lot of excitement here. I think but it's unknown. Like what are they doing with this? So in terms of Facebook, I have some concern like messaging. Like how much of a focus is it? I would say it seems to be much more of a focus than these, but it does still make me worried. Other risk in the West for messaging potential is like payment. So if you look to a market like China, where basically we're having a lot of success, they also have much more flexibility with payment. So doing direct carrier billing, sort of having this basically equivalent of like PayPal in the market. Users are used to paying in games with these different payment methods, whereas users in the West are going to be much less comfortable with these new types of payment methods. To try and decouple like your content from the App Store and using like direct payment, just getting users comfortable with that, I think that's going to be very difficult. And this to me is like the sort of giant flag is this idea of distribution control from the App Store perspective, right? In my perspective, like Apple especially does not like for anyone that's not them to have control over the charts or the store or distribution. So if you think of something back to these like free app a day, basically they eventually got kicked out of the store because it was for mimicking the App Store experience. And then even when I was working with the messaging apps, at some point randomly, like years into their strategy, their app would get rejected because they were basically saying that you can't show apps in this way in terms of distribution. So I think it's proven that basically Apple wants control. And so I think from the Facebook side, I think they understand that they could drive like significant distribution, but as soon as you show that, flex that muscle, what does Apple, what does Google do? I think people, do they take you out of the store because you're violating these other policies? When you have like, your main distribution channel is from the iTunes store. It sounds crazy, but if you look at like this example, so basically this is a game doing $4 million a day, and Apple kicked out of the store because they violated some pretty minimal policy. So that's, Apple's making $1 million+ a day, gone because you violated policy. So it's not insane to think that basically, you start flexing your muscle, the App Store pushes back on you, even if you are Facebook. My understanding is the version of the basic messenger with the games took many months of discussion to actually be released. So I need to wrap up here. Another concern for me is like the unknown revenue model. So basically, are we doing ads? Are they going to do some sort of cross-game currency? Then you're giving up another, cut to Facebook on top of the Apple, Google. Is it a distribution channel, like shifting, audience from your messenger games to your native experience as your sort of indirect revenue? I don't know. So to me, basically, to wrap up, to me the key for this, something like instant games to become a transformational platform. Right now you have kind of the consumer, they go to the App Store, they download Messenger, they're in Messenger, they launch the games. We need to get rid of this. Whether it's Facebook Messenger or another platform, I don't know, but to me that's where you get basically the flexibility to create the revenue model that has the largest market potential. And the flexibility to promote games within the experience that will maximize distribution. So I'm still very bullish on this opportunity, but maybe a little bit less than other people in the market. But luckily there are also other companies trying this HTML5 type games distribution. A lot of it's happening in Asia. You have different platforms that already have launched with pretty significant distribution behind them. So it's not just can Facebook Messenger figure it out, but potentially others as well. Cool. So over time, but thanks very much.
I have a question.
Okay.
So I think today you mentioned a lot about the WeChat from the East. And then previously, like every Eastern platforms are copying or cloning the Western platforms like Facebook. Now it looks like the Western is kind of learning from the Eastern platform. Do you think Facebook is the only prominent platforms now, or are there opportunities for other platforms that's going to be emerging to provide similar functionalities like WeChat?
Yeah, I think there's definitely people trying that have different perspectives, it's gaming or just communication. But I think for these platforms to be really meaningful, we need to get to hundreds of millions of users, and that's, again, right now means coming through the App Store to getting those downloads to sort of start your traffic. So I definitely think it's possible, but Facebook obviously has a huge lead, but the space is quite crowded now. So I'd say it's definitely possible, but much less likely than 2 or 3 years ago.
Thank you so much.
Sure.